What they're talking about is taking away the rights of law-abiding, peaceable citizens in countries like the United States to keep and bear our arms, to keep and bear the arms that our founding fathers thought were so important that they put them in the Bill of Rights. And you know, without the Bill of Rights, the Constitution never would have been ratified. Without the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, and the rest of the rights in those first 10 amendments, the Constitution would never have been ratified. We wouldn't be here. We'd probably be, well, you'd be back in Scotland. Right, Jim? Jim would be back in Scotland. You know, everybody here in this room has a path that brought you here tonight, and so do I. My story began about 30 years ago. I was living in Los Angeles, and I had a wake-up call. And I mean that literally. Something woke me up in the middle of the night. And it was a noise at my front door. Now, I thought it was a raccoon. I lived kind of out in the suburbs. And I went downstairs. I was living alone in a house. I looked through the peephole in my front door, and there was a man on my porch with a screwdriver that he was trying to break through the lock of my door. Now, I wasn't a gun owner then. I grew up in the suburbs of the Bay Area, right? Not the most conservative part of the country. People often ask me when I speak there, well, what's a nice girl like you doing playing with guns? I tell them, well, it's part of my constitutional rights. But I didn't own guns then. I didn't know anything about guns then. I'd never shot a gun. I was 32 years old and I'd never shot a gun. My dad didn't have guns. He didn't hunt or shoot. Nobody I went to school with, none of their families had guns either. So I didn't know anything about guns. I wasn't anti-gun. They just weren't a part of my life. I didn't need them. This guy was trying to break through my door, so I banged on the inside of the door figuring he'd probably go away. But he didn't. He kept working, trying to get in. And I called my neighbor next door. I lived in a housing development. The next house was like 30 feet away. Nobody answered the phone. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. I called my neighbor on the other side. Nobody answered the phone there. I was afraid to leave the house. If they weren't answering the phone, they sure weren't going to answer the door. I called the police finally. And they said, well, lock yourself in your bedroom. And I said, my bedroom door doesn't have a lock on it. And you know what? And I say this especially to the ladies out there. I was scared. I realized that if this guy got into my house, I had no options. I had no way to protect myself, and nobody was coming. The cavalry was not coming to save me. And I realized that night that I am the person ultimately responsible for my own safety. You can't count on anybody else. You know, just like Jim was telling you to write a thank you letter to President Obama, I've often thanked that guy, who, by the way, the police never caught. They finally did show up. It took them 15 minutes to get there. A lot of bad things can happen in 15 minutes. I was married to a law enforcement officer. My late husband was career law enforcement. And the guy I'm dating now is a law enforcement officer. And they were both the ones who would always remind me that when seconds count, the police are only minutes away. You got to be ready, because you can't count on somebody else to take care of your problem. Now, I thank that guy, because that incident set me on the path that led me here to this room tonight. Overnight, I became a gun owner. I went to a store the next day and wanted to buy a gun, and I told the guy behind the counter, I'd like to buy a gun. The man says, yes, ma'am, what kind of gun are you looking for? I don't know. Any gun, I said. And I think he got a little worried about what I was going to do with it. So he asked me what I was going to do with this gun, and I told him what had happened, and he said, well, I think you should take a gun safety class first. So I did. And one of the parts of the class was you got to shoot on the indoor range. And I'd done a little bit of archery in high school, so all the rounds went into this little tiny hole. And he said, how did you do that? And I said, I did exactly what you told me to do. And to this day, I will tell you, ladies out there, women make awesome shots. You know, guys, I hate to say it, but men are all born knowing how to drive, dress, and shoot. Am I right? And you can't tell them, you can't give them any advice about those subjects. But women listen, and women make good shots. They make really good students of pistol craft especially. So, you know, I got a gun, started going to the range, was practicing, and I was always hoping one day that that guy would come back to my door, because I was ready for him. Now, I was never political either. But when California in the early 80s decided to pass a statewide handgun ban, Proposition 15, I thought, wait a minute, I have become a safe, responsible gun owner. I go to the range, I practice, I abide by the laws, and I feel safe now in my home. And now they want to take my gun away? No government, no matter how well-meaning, is going to take away my constitutional rights. So I started politicking, and I went door to door and talked to people and told them, this is a bad idea to take away handguns from law-abiding people, because you know the criminals are never going to give up their guns. And when I moved to Arizona in 1985, I became politically active to protect my gun rights. I like to tell people that I'm a living, breathing example of that old adage that a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged. I learned my lesson. Now, Alan talked a little bit about the Heller case, and there's been renewed interest in the Second Amendment since the Heller case. What is remarkable about that case is not just the decision that the Supreme Court came out with, the 5-4 decision. We won by 1 vote, people. 4 of the justices on the highest court of our land did not think that the Second Amendment was an individual right. Can you believe that? Yep. It is unbelievable to me. If I had known when I was in law school that they were going to feel that way about guns, I probably would have quit law school and gone to medical school or something. I mean, it is awful to think that 4 of the 9 justices of the highest court of our land thought that that was only a collective right that we could exercise with the permission of our government. Heck, if it was supposed to be a collective right, and if the government was supposed to control it, what was the whole point of putting it into the Bill of Rights to begin with? Now, the court held that the Second Amendment does guarantee, not confer, but guarantee the right of the people to keep and bear arms, our individual rights as private, peaceable, law-abiding citizens. And no government can take it away. But Heller left a lot of issues to be decided, one of which will be decided before the end of this month, which is whether or not the protection of that individual right applies not just to our federal government and in the District of Columbia, which is a federal enclave, but whether it applies in the rest of the states, like Massachusetts and Arizona and California and Illinois. We all learned in school, and you folks here in Massachusetts know better than anybody about the flashpoint for the American Revolution. You know, the shot heard round the world on April 19, 1775 was fired on Lexington Common. And 7 Americans lay dead after that shooting, and it became very apparent to everybody there that war was inevitable after that conflict. And I was talking to some folks tonight about what were the British doing that day that caused this problem. Well, they were marching to Concord, Massachusetts, on orders from Lieutenant General Thomas Gage. And what were they going to do? They were going to seize the firearms and the ammunition in the armory. Think about it. The act that sparked the American Revolution was an attempt by the then legitimate government to disarm the American civilian population. Kind of gives you chills, doesn't it? And our forefathers, our founding fathers, ladies and gentlemen, if you judge by what Great Britain thought, were all criminals. They were all traitors. They risked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to found this country. And you know what would have happened if they'd lost the Revolutionary War? They would have all been hung as traitors. We're worried about making a few people feel bad because we tell them we don't want our gun rights taken away. Think about what our forefathers did. You know, there have only been a handful of occasions since the Bill of Rights was ratified when the Supreme Court has directed the states that they, too, must obey the amendments in the Bill of Rights, like the First Amendment, for example. You know, the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of the press, but it doesn't prevent the states from doing that. And one by one, most, not all, but most of the amendments in the Bill of Rights have been incorporated to the states. All we're asking for in the McDonald case is that the Second Amendment be incorporated as well.